Hey everybody, welcome back. Now we're going to go over some great communication tips, and here's your very first one. And this is kind of an overriding one that you want to be looking at constantly as you're presenting, which is what communication is when you're presenting to somebody. You want to look at, is it helping or is it hurting? Think of it this way. I'm trying to make the sale. Is it getting me closer to closing the sale or farther away? I want to connect with somebody. Is it creating connection or disconnection? I want to keep people interested. Is it creating interest or lack of interest, like this poor guy nose down on the table? Notice which one you're doing. By getting this feedback, this will help you stay on track, hit the right spot, and actually move in the direction you're trying to move in. Great tip. Now, here's a little piece of reality. People are much more interested, much more interested in what they have to say than what you have to say. People are always going to be more excited about talking in a conversation than listening in a conversation. We're going to talk a little bit later on about conversational generosity and how that works, and this will make more and more sense to you as you go on. But a lot of people think conversation is about being a great talker. A lot of times it's about being a great listener and being as interested, sometimes if you want to create excitement, being more interested in what the other person has to say than what they're saying. That will create high likability with the person, help you connect with them, and ultimately make the sale. Whatever you're trying to sell, someone an idea, a product, a concept, maybe even on helping themselves. Let's dive a little deeper into this. Most people actually aren't communicating. They're just taking turns talking. People are literally waiting for you to take a breath so they can jump in and say the next brilliant thing that they thought of. Here's how a typical conversation goes. You say something. It sparks an idea in the person that you're talking to. They start sub-vocalizing, which is internal self-talk, and they go blah, 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 what they thought about your very first idea. Now, everything you say after the first idea, they pretty much missed. Then they get to talk, and they say, this is great. I'm going to tell this person something, and they're going to get all this information. Then they say something, and the first thing that they say triggers something in you. You start thinking about it, and you're saying blah, 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 blah in the back of your mind, thinking about how brilliant you are, about going over what they had just said, and you miss the next 15 things that they say because you're talking in your own head. And this cycle repeats and repeats and repeats. So, what we want to do is make sure that when we're talking with somebody, we're getting good communication across. And one way that you can do that is to interrupt them with a question. Ask them a question about what you're talking about. That will get them out of their head and focus back on what you're talking about. So I'll say, hey, there was one time when I was in such and such a situation, blah, 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 blah. And I'll say, have you ever been in a situation like that? And I give them a quick minute to respond. But it stops the talking in their head. And then I go on to my next point. What I really want to tell you about is blah, 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 blah. Is that something that you feel you could use? See how the question stops the self-talk? Whatever blah, 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 blah they were doing in their mind, they have to stop and focus and answer the question. So, make sure that when you're talking to somebody, that they're actually listening. They're not glazed over. And when they're talking, I want you actually listening to what they're saying, not going with this sub-vocalization talk in your own mind. Does that make sense? Listen to what they say. You can think about it for days after. Don't be spending too much time thinking about it while they're talking about it, except to analyze what are their values, what are their beliefs, and what's important to them. That's all the sub-vocalization you should be doing. Now, when you're generous in letting somebody talk, they'll almost talk themselves out, and then they're more likely to listen to you and not be so hyper to jump in when you take a breath and say something. More about that later. This is an interesting one. I always tell people that people are tuned into a radio station called WIIFM. What's in it for me? People always want to know when you're communicating, the thing that they care about the most, bar none, is what's in it for them. Everybody is self-motivated. That means they're motivated by self. What's in it for them? So when you're talking about things, don't talk about why it's important to the government or society or the world as a whole. How are they going to make money? How are they going to benefit from this? How is this going to solve them a problem? How is it going to make them look good? That's all they care about. So make sure when you're trying to get a point across that you're telling them what's in it for them. If you're not talking about what's in it for them, because remember, they're tuned to a radio station called WIIFM. What's in it for me? If you're not tuned into that, they will tune you out. Now, here's a great tip whenever you're networking, whenever you're talking, whenever you're trying to communicate with another person and you really want to connect with them. Write this down, print out the slide, whatever you need to do. It's much better to be interested than interesting. A lot of people think, well, to be a great communicator, to make an impression, to have people like you, you've got to be, funny and charismatic and this or that. People are starved. Starved. I can tell you as a therapist, they'll pay me $300 an hour to sit there and listen to them. Why? Because they are starved for somebody to listen to them. So, much better to be interested in the other person. Personally, who they are, their cares, their concerns, what's interesting to them. You will seem like a brilliant conversationalist if you're a really good listener. So you want to talk about half as much as you speak. They say that's why you got 2 ears and 1 mouth, so that you can keep your conversation in that proportion. Listen twice as much as you talk. Be interested in them. Find what they're saying fascinating, and then they will what? The law of reciprocity says they will listen to you when you speak. So, listening. Here's some main listening skills. 1, listen. Never, ever miss a perfectly good opportunity to listen. Caring. Be there for the person. And not just be there for them, not just be listening, but show them that you care. You say, that must be so hard for you. That must have been great when that happened. Wow, what was that like? Reflect that you're actually caring, that you're interested, and that you care for them. Our best friends are the ones that care for us. And when our best friends talk, we what? We listen. Why? Because they care about us. Following. So, following, listening is more than just, sitting there and not talking. You have to make sure that you're engaged. Use eye contact, non-intrusive gestures, nodding your head, saying okay, asking very infrequent questions, adding to. That's so true. I remember one time when okay, but make it very brief. That really worked for me one time. Boom, you're in, you're out. I know that to be true. Man, you're speaking the truth to me. I know what that's like. Okay, that shows that you're following. I remember when that happened to me one time. That's following. But in and out quick. Don't get into a story that they got to listen to about you. Reflecting. Reflecting is paraphrasing and reflecting back the feelings you're sensing. Wow, that must have been really hard for you. I can remember when that happened to me one time, and it was really painful. Paraphrasing is saying the same thing back. Say, when my girlfriend left me, I was absolutely crushed. Say, wow, I can see why you were crushed. That's paraphrasing. I can see why you were crushed. Boom. That must have been very painful for you. Painful is another way to say crushed. Okay? So therapists get really good at this, but the average person needs to get really good at this as well. And this is the final piece just for this little section here on great tips. This is huge. If you learn nothing else in this training about conversation except this, conversational generosity is huge. It's one of the big tips that you want to remember. Now, remember, because people are tuned into that radio station, WIIFM, what's in it for me? When you talk, this is like Einstein's theory of relativity. He said, you know, when you spend an hour with a girl, it seems shorter than any minute. That's relativity, right? You know, when you spend an hour with a pretty girl, it seems like a minute. When you spend a minute doing something you don't like, it seems like an hour. That's relativity. So, when you're talking, it seems like a long time to the person. When they're talking, it seems like time whizzes by, like it's a short period of time. So, these percentages are pretty accurate. When you talk half the time, they are going to think that you took up pretty much, you know, 2/3 to 3/4 of the conversation. It's going to feel like 70%. When you talk 40% of the time, you're going to think you were generous, but it really sounds more like 50-50 to them. That's the way it feels, and that's the way they remember. Remember, their perception of the conversation is everything, because this is what? This is the person you're trying to talk to, the person you're trying to influence. Their perception, not reality, is what is key. So, this is why I say listen twice as much as you talk. Because if you're talking in those proportions, you're only talking what? About 30% of the time. That's going to seem like about 40% of the time to them, which is going to be noticeably less than half, but just barely. So they're going to say, hey, this person didn't dominate the conversation. They actually listened to me. They didn't try to overpower me, which means what? Talking 50-50 like everybody else, you know. Or God help them if they ever do run into somebody who talks 70% of the time. They're going to feel like it was 100 or 110% of the time. See how this works? I like to talk around 30 to 20% of the time. And if I'm talking 30% of the time, even part of that is going back to confirming, noticing their feelings, reaffirming, you know, that they're correct in certain things where they are correct, you know, giving them validation, not just me talking about what I want to talk about. So that will seem like I'm not even talking, because when you're validating somebody, it seems like they're talking, except they're finally getting the validation they never had before. People are starved for two things: time to talk and validation. Those are the two things that they are craving and they are starved for. So remember that in communication. So depending upon how much you want people to like you, I would say never do more than 40%. You want to live in that 30% and down category, and the more you want them to like you, go down, 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 down. If I really want somebody to like me, I go to 10 to 20%. I hardly ever talk, and I spend half that time validating, confirming, you know, rephrasing, letting them know that I'm connecting, letting them know that I'm emotionally attached to what they're saying. So I'm really, even if I'm talking 20% of the time, I'm really only saying something 10% of the time. The rest is to support them. Same thing with the 10%. I'm really only talking about 5%, 1/20th of the conversation. The other 5% is validating them. So go ahead and really drop down your numbers. Start to listen way more than you talk. Start to do the validation, the paraphrasing, everything that we've talked about. And if you just follow the tips in this one section, you will do significantly better, and you will be a true master of communication. But don't worry, we've got more, and I'll see you in the next section.